immigrant food who happens to be in this building for providing that to us today. I'm really excited about this next session. This is sort of another one of these quick hit intros to some data and some research. And I think we should all feel really fortunate. We're getting to hear about research into funding from someone who represents a funder. So I'm really excited to introduce Robert Griffin. He's the Associate Director for Research at the Democracy Fund to talk to us about the boom and bust cycles in philanthropy.
Hey everyone, assume you can hear me okay. All right, good, excellent. That's a picture of me, not a great one, also with missing gray hair, that's fine. I'm gonna be talking about the boom and bust cycle. I think I only have 15 minutes, so I'm gonna move pretty quickly. Just to give you a quick guide in case you get lost anywhere in the talk. What did we wanna know? How did we actually go about researching it? What did we find? What are we doing about it? Those are the four kind of bits that we're gonna touch on. So first off, what did we want to know? So there's a lot of narratives within the democracy space about the boom and bust cycle in philanthropic giving and the resources that grantees have, right? Just for anybody who's not familiar, just to make sure we're covering bases here, general idea is that we see a boom of revenue and resources happening in election years and a bust of revenue and resources in post-election years. And the thing is, for as much as this is talked about, there's not a lot of empirical exploration of what this problem actually looks like, right? So to the extent that you might want to actually prevent this problem from happening, to stop people from doing it, knowing the shape of it, knowing the underlying dynamics of it seems like a reasonable thing to want to do, but just no one had done it to date. So one of the things that myself, along with Democracy Funders Network did was to kind of help build up a database to be able to answer questions like this. I won't talk too much about the database today. There's another talk later today at 4 if you want to learn more. I'll mostly get into the findings, but I'll talk a little bit about the data just to kind of give you a sense of it. But really, we were just trying to answer, for the purposes of this presentation, how consistent and widespread is this dynamic? And where does that volatility in funding come from? So again, just start to lay out some of the basic dynamics of this. How do we research this? So really quick, again, there'll be a longer talk at 4 if you're really interested in this. But the first thing you do is you define a universe of grantees that make up the democracy space. That's a big, wide, nebulous concept. By our reckoning, there is something like 4,000 organizations that constitute that in the United States, probably an undercount, but that's sort of where we landed. You develop a schema that categorizes those grantee organizations, so you can actually sort of bucket them up and say there's people over here that do this type of work, and this type of work, and this type of work. That goes back and forth a little bit, because as you define a schema, you find more people who actually belong in that space, and then you change your schema to accommodate more people that you found, and yada, yada, yada. You collect a lot of tax data for grantees and their funders over time, so this is actually really important. You have to collect information from both the grantees that you're talking about as well as the funders of those grantees to be able to connect financial data about what's happening at these organizations. You'll see how that sort of plays out in a graph later. And then the final and most important step is that you force yourself to present at a conference so that actually all this work gets done. For anybody looking for this stuff, this is the most important step. Again, won't talk about it too much today, but if you are interested, all the data that's essentially being presented on today is coming from the US Democracy Hub. So this is something that was a project between Impala and DFN. I was sort of an advisor on a lot of this project. To essentially just sort of collect all this data, have it in a place, be able to make sure you can download it and look at it and analyze it in a variety of different ways. Just so you know, for the purposes of the analysis you'll be seeing today, this is election-related organizations, right? So we're looking at the boom and bust cycle, and particularly those who are working on voter rights, voter mobilization, election administration, and what we call quality candidates, which is sort of thinking about sort of candidate development and things like that. So these are everything the results you're going to be seeing today is organizations that represent these fields of work. So, what did we find? I'll start you off thinking about organizational revenue at an individual level. So what we're thinking about is sort of year-over-year change in the revenue that these organizations see, right? So if the boom and bust cycle story is happening, what we should see in post-election years is a decline in revenue rather than an increase in revenue for a lot of organizations. And, maybe not so shockingly, that is what we see, right? So in each of these bars, right, you've got 2013, that is the growth rate relative to 2012. 2015, that's relative to 2014, so on and so forth as you go forward in time. You can generally see that like this is in at least sort of the maybe low 60s, which is 2019 number. That's actually kind of a special year, as we'll talk about in just a minute. But more often, you're actually probably looking at like the 70s, and in 2021, not shockingly maybe, as high as like over 80%. That's probably like 82, 83% actually saw their revenue decline in that post-election year. I'll break that out for you just a little bit so you can see how much it grew and declined by. So that organizations at the bottom, I'll just sort of walk through that really quickly. That's organizations who had only 25% of the budget in the post-election year as they had in their actual election year, right? So in general, right, studying this stuff just as a researcher, it's like, first off, is this phenomenon real? Yes, right? So we are seeing this in the data along with all the accounts that we get from grantees and everybody else. But at an individual level, we can see that the majority of organizations are seeing declines in their revenue in any given year. And especially in 2021, really, really significant, right, relative to their 2020 resources. There's like, what is that? It's about 25% of organizations had less than 25% of the budget that they did in the previous year. I have a pause here on 2023 just to give you all a note. 2023, for a lot of reasons, is highly modeled data. That is to say, we don't actually have all of the data in yet. So this is a little bit of guesswork. Read it with a little bit of like skepticism, but we have pretty good reason to think it's accurate, that 2023 is probably about as bad as 2021 is in relative terms. So as you'll see in a minute, there's actually like less money in the system in 2022 relative to like 2020, but these declines are still really, really significant in these years. That's at the individual level, right? So that's like thinking, okay, each organization, I'm kind of tracking it piece by piece, saying how much money is going from their budget from one year to the other year. Now we're going to look at this all in aggregate, right? So the total amount of money that's in this space, those organizations that we talked about in any given year. So a couple of things to notice here. We'll start on the left side of the graph, is you do see that sort of boom and bust style revenue happening from essentially 2013 through 2017, right? You see that, just those little bumps up and down as there's sort of more and less money in the system. 2018 and 2019 start to represent a very different dynamic in the space. Even though at the individual level, right, we saw less money coming in for some of these organizations, there's so many organizations coming online in this particular space during that 2019 period that the amount of money actually goes up relative to 2018, almost in preparation for 2020, where we see this massive spike in money. At this point, the field is topping out. Again, this is just 501c3, 501c4 space at about $3 billion. And then obviously, again, this really dramatic drop-off in 2021 relative to the resources that were in the field in 2020, with then 2022 bouncing back just a little bit. Again, a little bit of guesswork. It's modeled. We're relatively confident in it, but we're not quite sure. We think there's a similar style of decline so that we're sort of back in this boom-bust land in this post-2020 environment. I'll break this down just a little bit for you in a second because, again, one of our goals here is also be able to talk essentially about where the revenue is increasing or essentially where it's sort of bouncing around from. So just to break it down for you quick, the bars you're going to see in here, one of them is coming from institutional philanthropy, right? So these are foundations, organizations that are sort of, designed to sort of give out money. There's a orange category that's going to be other grants and donations. You can think about this as small dollar donations. You can think about it as large donors who also just don't have foundations behind them necessarily or legal entities that would be sort of sucked up in all this stuff. And then in gray, you'll have all the other revenue. So program services and government grants and all sorts of other sort of ways that they get money. But what you're seeing is essentially that, especially for this 2020 boost, the vast, obvious majority of that increase is coming from institutional philanthropy. It's jumping by essentially almost $1 billion between 2019 and 2020. And then that same amount of drop-off is almost happening once we get out to 2021. So again, if we were to start to take guesses about where this boom and bust is coming from, certainly the case in a post-2020 world that this is booming and busting from institutional philanthropy, right? This is not small dollar donations gone awry type of thing. A lot of organizations came in and then a swift number also sort of came out at the same time. You see some of that same boom bustiness coming from other sources of revenue, but it's not nearly at the scale as we're seeing from sort of institutional philanthropy. 2023. So modeled actually at this point that I cannot present anything in terms of this breakdown. But again, we do know that it's lower. So that I would just say, like, back of the envelope, if you had to look at that and sort of do some eye math, right, you would guess that institutional philanthropy has once again busted in this sort of post-election period relative to 2022. Don't have data on 2024 yet. There's sort of IRS has a long-term delays in sort of giving us access to this data. But eventually we're going to be sort of filling this out as that data comes in. So what are we doing about it? I'll talk just very briefly about a campaign that Democracy Fund has been engaged in. I think we launched it in sort of late September, early October, somewhere around there. But something called Election Data Every Day. And the general idea was essentially trying to talk to funders about this behavior and to get them to stop it over a longer time period. So, I don't have to tell a room like this. This is disruptive behavior. It makes it very hard to actually do any kind of planning that's long-term. It makes it hard to do any type of investment when these resources are just sort of on a whim sometimes, right? Both at an organizational level, but also at a sector level, right? That we're not sure how much money is even going to be flowing in, regardless of who it goes to. So just to say, we've been asking essentially folks to do one, if not more, of the following. Which is start planning early, right? Giving people sort of assurances about what's coming next in the coming year. Providing bridges in terms of funding, whether that's actual bridge funding, moving up payments, letting people know about renewed support earlier so they can actually do planning. Committing to multi-year support, right? So making these not sort of one-year grants, but actually sort of letting people sort of build out longer-term strategies with an assurance of these resources. And particularly in the environment we're in, we're asking people to think about the safety and security of grantees. Because, well, again, I don't have to tell a room like this, but there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's both legal and extra legal in the United States. To date, I think this is a little outdated, so the number's probably a little bit higher, but we've got essentially 74 of these people who represent foundations, individual donors, donor networks, things of that nature, who have supported to signing on to this. I am just about at time. For anyone who is interested in learning more about the data source that's actually behind this, we're going to be having a talk 4 to 5 p.m. down in Classroom B. I've been Rob Griffin. You've been a lovely audience. I'll see you all at 4.